Hello, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kevin Iger, Managing Director of PFP, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today for our monthly webinar. Now today I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah, who's Associate Partner of Claritax and Head of Dispute Resolution. And Sarah's going to go through some of what she's seeing at the moment in terms of increased HMRC activity, what we can expect and how we can handle it. So a really practical webinar today for everybody. So Sarah, perhaps if I could ask you to say hello and just tell everybody a little bit about your background and experience, please.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Kevin. So as Kevin said, I'm Sarah Scala and I lead the Tax Dispute Resolution Service for Claritas Tax. I've been working in tax for the past 15 years. I'm a chartered tax advisor, and the last 10 years I have spent handling HMRC dispute-related matters day in, day out. 8 years with Grant Thornton in their National Tax Investigations team, and just over a year ago I joined Claritas Tax to lead this service offering for them. So I'm hoping that through my dealings with HMRC day in, day out, I can share some knowledge with you, and as Kevin said, some practical advice of how to handle HMRC in particularly difficult situations.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So before we carry on, there will be copies of the slides available at the end of the webinar. If anybody has any questions, as usual, please enter them into the question box as we go along, and we'll get through as many as we can. Sarah has said that she likes the trickier questions, so the thornier the better. You could send them in. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kevin. Right, so the agenda for this afternoon's webinar, I will provide a brief introduction to Claritas Tax, some of which I've just shared with you. I'll then go on to talk about current HMRC activity, and I want to particularly focus on what you may have heard in the press and from HMRC about what they say they are targeting, and then I'd like to share with you what people like me are actually seeing in practice. I would like to provide my top tips for handling HMRC inquiries. I'm going to suggest to you some red flags to look out for on your inquiry work that may suggest you would benefit from speaking to a tax dispute resolution specialist, not necessarily to put in place a formal engagement for them to work with you or your client, but just to have somebody in the background that you could maybe bounce strategy suggestions off. And then we'll end with a quick summary of the points covered, and you will have the opportunity to ask any more questions that you may have come to mind during the presentation. So I've said a bit about me. Firstly, I'll just explain about Claritas Tax. So they are a tax advisory firm that have been going for 10 years. The 10-year anniversary this year nicely coincides with us winning the Tolley's Taxation Award earlier this year for Best Independent Tax Consultancy, which we're really proud of. We're a team of around 40 chartered tax advisors, all offering specialist tax services. We're not accountants, so we don't compete with our accountancy referrer network. We're here to offer specialist advice, often on one-off, fairly complex transactions. As I said, I lead the Tax Dispute Resolution Service. I am quite well connected with the tax dispute world, particularly since joining Claritas, as that was important to me, having come from a larger national team. I'm a contributor to the HMRC Inquiries, Investigations and Powers magazine. I am a member of the Tax Crime Alliance, which brings together HMRC, the private practice and the professional bodies. And I'm the founder of the Contentious Tax Group, which brings together specialist lawyers, fellow tax dispute and investigations professionals, and we discuss strategy on cases, inconsistencies we're finding with HMRC treatment, topical issues, and the prime objective is that we can all enhance the services that we offer our own clients, and I am quite keen to cascade those insights obtained through the group to the wider profession. So that's a bit about me and Claritas Tax, and sort of an introduction to why I'm here today to talk about all things tax disputes. So I'm going to start with talking about current HMRC activity. I think no tax investigations type webinar would be complete without sharing what it is I'm seeing and hearing about from my network. The first thing to say is that unfortunately for me, rather fortunately for those not wanting inquiries on their own client base, HMRC don't appear to have reached their pre-pandemic levels of compliance checks. So whilst HMRC activity has increased, there's still some way to go before we reach the sort of activity we were seeing pre-COVID. What we are seeing is that inquiries that were paused have now resumed. That's great in terms of moving closer towards settling long-standing inquiries and investigations, but it doesn't come without its problems. So some of the problems that you may come across as HMRC resume inquiries and investigations after a couple of years worth of break is you might, for example, find that the HMRC caseworker has changed. You might find that your own day-to-day management team, somebody within that chain has moved on. You might find changes at the client's end. I've had a case with Claritas where we'd taken on a new client and we knew that there was some form of inquiry ongoing, but when we wrote for clearance, the former advisors suggested that we ask the client. The client asked us to ask the former agent what the inquiry was about, where it was up to. So a colleague of mine asked me to find that information out by using my connections within HMRC. So all of these problems can create a duplication of work, unfortunately, not helped by the fact that HMRC now seem to have adopted this new way of working where they're very reluctant to travel, to attend meetings, and whilst we talk about using Zoom and Teams as a way to have a virtual meeting, HMRC is still reluctant to, for example, put their video on. So if you get them to speak on a call, it really is no more than a telephone call type of discussion. So I would have thought the best way to bring everyone up to speed would be to sit down and talk about it, but unfortunately you'll find you've got an inquiry that's resumed and the discussion about where it's up to might have to take place via lengthy letters sent by post. You've also got the issue that if there is any additional tax, interest will have been accruing, and whilst it is possible to make an appeal against interest to the interest review unit, HMRC are very unlikely to accept that any delay has been on their part. To appeal the interest successfully, you need to evidence unreasonable delay on the part of HMRC, and that might be quite challenging if COVID is actually to blame for the delay. So you may see inquiries and investigations start back up again. There are some challenges with getting them going, and I'd suggest that it's worth taking a step back, confirming in your mind which parties are still involved, who's involved from each organisation, and potentially revisiting the strategy, because you may find that needs to be adjusted slightly. Moving on to HMRC campaigns, I'm always interested to hear what HMRC's latest focuses are. Fortunately for me, given I'm presenting today, we've had a new HMRC campaign kick off just this month. This campaign has been designed to coincide with a requirement, a Companies House reporting requirement that has been introduced. So it is now a requirement for the ultimate beneficial owners of offshore structures holding UK property to be reported to Companies House, and that needs to be done by the 31st of January 2023. So HMRC have this month started a nudge letter campaign whereby they will be writing out to the ultimate beneficial owners, many likely to be offshore, and they will be suggesting that there might be underdeclared rents, ATED liabilities and gains on this UK property portfolio. So it's worth keeping a lookout for letters of that type. As yet, I haven't heard mention of any being received, and I suspect it might really start to kick off once that 31st of January 2023 Companies House reporting date has passed, because of course then HMRC will be able to see details of these ultimate beneficial owners that have been recorded, and they can start following up on those. But of course you may come across clients that are clearly caught by this campaign, and best advice is, if that's the case and they have they're linked with these undeclared rents, ATED liabilities and gains, there's absolutely no reason, and it would be recommended, no reason not to, and it would be recommended to go to HMRC before they write out. Another thing that has been in the press quite a lot lately is news of the Euro-Pacific Bank, and Simon York, who is the head of the Fraud Investigation Service at HMRC, recorded a very serious video recently, which was published, where he explained that this Puerto Rican bank has been investigated for facilitating tax evasion and money laundering. And not only is it the case that HMRC believe UK resident account holders will have unpaid UK tax liabilities, but they're going a step further and they're suggesting that these individuals probably use the bank because they were deliberately seeking to avoid and evade paying these taxes. So really serious issue here that HMRC are focusing on, and it's believed that around 600 UK resident account holders will be affected, which feels like a small number, but on this one I have spoken to a number of people with letters. It's believed that what HMRC are in possession of are sample bank statements for these accounts. So for some of you that are familiar with the Common Reporting Standard and the information that HMRC receives from the offshore jurisdictions on that, you may know that HMRC receive annual account balances. Whereas on this one, a sample of bank statements, in my opinion, probably gives more insight into the account activity. So again, same advice here. If you have clients or you come across taxpayers that are affected, they may have a letter, a nudge letter about them having a Euro-Pacific bank account, or they may not have a letter, but best advice would be to consider going forward to HMRC. Moving on to something that has been met with scepticism in the accounting industry in recent weeks, and that is news that HMRC are writing out to the wealthiest taxpayers, suggesting that they might want to chat with HMRC ahead of submitting their 21-22 tax return. Obviously, one might think that HMRC have enough to do without adding this additional service to its customers, as it might say, to its list. Firstly, what is wealthy? I suppose it's worth stating what is defined as wealthy for this purpose. Well, HMRC suggests it's anyone with income over £200,000 a year, or with assets valued at over £2 million. So those individuals may be contacted by HMRC and offered this chat via a meeting or telephone call. And I think you could, of course, have a look at your client base and establish who might be approached, and it might be worth letting them know of this if you haven't already. But really, I'd suggest that we step back a bit from all the fuss that's being made about this, particularly on LinkedIn and things, and stay true to our advice as it would always have been, which is no doubt to encourage your clients not to ever speak to HMRC unaccompanied, and always have professional representation if any discussions take place, because as we know, somebody not well versed in tax speak could easily suggest something that HMRC get excited about, and therefore causes unnecessary questioning. The final thing I'll mention is research and development claims and the focus that HMRC have on that at the moment. For any of you who make claims on behalf of clients, you'll no doubt be getting frustrated by the additional time it's taking for those claims to be reviewed and processed. Unfortunately, that is partly down to HMRC's enhanced checks of claims to try to stamp out any fraudulent claims. And as part of that, we've heard that some inquiries are now being opened by Fraud Investigation Service. So I suppose key messaging is this has been in the headlines. Obviously, 99% of claims are not in any way fraudulent or deliberate. Unfortunately, they're taking a bit longer to go through. Any fraudulent deliberate claims need special attention and specialist advice, but it's probably worth me mentioning that of the people I'm speaking to, as in people that do a similar line of work to myself, we're not really seeing many of these letters, so it does look like they're being reserved for the most serious of cases. So that is my view of what I read about, hear about, and how I see it flowing through to my workload and the opportunities that are coming my way. Of course, there are lots of other things going on as well, so please don't feel that you can't ask about anything else either on this call or in a follow-up discussion, but I thought it was probably worth clearing up any sort of misconceptions that might be presented in the media at present.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I've got a couple of questions here. One from Mehmet. Do the nudge letters that you've discussed include a certificate for signing or anything like that? And should you sign it if they do?
I think it depends on the type of campaign. As I said, on the first of the campaigns I mentioned with the property owned within offshore structures, we're yet to see any of those letters. The Euro-Pacific Bank ones, I'm not sure if they do. I've got one gentleman wanting to speak to me about one. I've not yet seen his letter. I could certainly find out, but whether they do or not, I think as you'll probably grasp as I continue with the webinar, caution should be taken to do what HMRC say is required without seeking specialist advice.
Okay, thank you. A question from Luke. You mentioned the R&D claims were being investigated. Have you any idea how they're identifying these potential fraud cases? Is it certain providers or certain types of claim, or what is it?
I think a combination of those. I mean, I think many of us are aware that firms have popped up specialising in R&D, and unfortunately, because it requires the technical expertise to make the claim, but then it does require the handling of an inquiry to manage HMRC should questions be asked. And unfortunately, some businesses are qualified to make claims, but then they're handling their own inquiries, often free of charge. So you know that's not a good idea, and if businesses aren't set up properly, then they could be a focus. I know that is happening, and then perhaps specific sectors. I mean, I've been asked to look into an inquiry recently, and the type of business is not one that you that would all ordinarily clearly have qualifying expenditure, and I'm sure that's something that HMRC pick up on.
Okay, great, thank you.
So shall we move on, Kevin?
Yep, sounds good. And as I said, anybody keep your questions coming in, please.
So I've talked about what I'm seeing at the moment. I just thought I'd break things up with an example here. And this is an example I included when I prepared the slides a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was a good example of how a gentleman had come to me. Turns out he thought he was under inquiry. I'm questioning that. I explained my view of his situation, suggested an alternative approach, so it made for quite a tidy example anyway. But what's happened since then is in my dealings with the HMRC office that had been communicating with this gentleman prior to him approaching me, I've had some really strange conversations with them. I found them really hard to deal with. They don't seem to know what they're doing, which I've sort of alluded to in answering one of those questions. So I think it's worth sharing all of that with you, because if for me, someone that deals with HMRC every day, I'm getting annoyed and frustrated, then it could be that you encounter the same situation and are not as familiar with them, and might benefit from my advice on this one. So I'll just start by setting out the background to this this case. I had a referral. I was told there was a gentleman who was under inquiry by HMRC because he had properties and he hadn't declared the rents. So, as I always do, I contacted the taxpayer, the potential client, and I said, I can certainly help you, but would you like to send me the latest HMRC correspondence for me to have a look at? And then I'll give you my thoughts, tell you what I think the proposed strategy for dealing with it is, and set out a fee estimate, etc. And when I received the two HMRC letters, one issued in December 21, the other in July of this year, I noticed straight away that the first letter seemed very much like a nudge letter to me. So as I said, nudge letters sometimes include certificates, sometimes not. This one didn't, but it did say, we suspect that you have let property. And then it went on to ask for some information. So addresses, duration of the ownership periods, when it might have been let out for. And this gentleman had 5 properties by this point. He acquired them through becoming initially an accidental landlord, couldn't sell his family home, and then he acquired several more. So I thought, well, up to now, I can't see any mention to the taxpayer of them being subject to a compliance check or inquiry. Other issues I had with the letter, there was no name on the bottom, there was no email address. So I looked at the second letter and it was very much the same, except by this point, HMRC had started to request bank statements, and I thought they really need to be setting out under what legal powers they're able to ask for this information. So I said to this gentleman, I think best advice to you is, it doesn't look like you've ever been told that you're under inquiry. I think you need to get away from this team. And I proposed making a let property campaign disclosure for him, so that I could take the lead on the information that was being offered up to HMRC, rather than allowing them to guide things through their questioning. Obviously, it's very advantageous that through a disclosure, I would be the one working out the tax liabilities and proposing a penalty. So we were happy with that, and I made the application. So the problems with this team, which is called the Individuals and Small Business Team in Nottingham, that I encountered were, the first time something happened, I was in my office and I received a call, and the lady said, "Hello, it's HMRC here. Before I can go any further, I need to put you through security." And my first thought was, well, I think I probably need to put you through security because you're the one calling me. But as is the way with HMRC, they're poor telephone manner, if anything, verifies their identity in my view, because I think, well, if it were a scam, I think the scammers would actually be better prepared. So the lady said to me, can I have your client's tax reference, please? And I said, well, you'll have to tell me which client you're ringing me about. And this was the feel of the conversation. And once I'd passed their security, the lady said, well, we've received your letter to say that you're not going to be responding with our inquiry points because you've made an application through the Let Property campaign. And I'd also asked for them to return the client's records to him. And the lady said, I'm just calling to let you know that we've received your letter, but we can't speak to you because you don't have HMRC or authority in place yet. And I said, well, I know, I'm in the process of setting that up. So really, it was just a complete waste of time, that telephone call, and just sets the tone for the type of team I'm dealing with here. So moving on, I rang the team back once my authority was in place. I explained that I didn't think that there was an inquiry. They said, well, there is an inquiry because this individual's being caught by the VSS. And you may wonder what the VSS is, which I certainly did. And apparently it's called the virtual street sweep, which I expect is one of HMRC's many means to gather data, and they've clearly viewed the street and identified some properties which by plugging data into their systems, their Connect system has brought to light that this gentleman owns several properties. So the lady said, well, he's been caught by the VSS and he has let property. And I said, well, yes, he does, but that doesn't mean he's under inquiry, or if he is, that you've told him he is. So I have ongoing discussions, and at present I'm waiting for somebody to call me to say, you know, whether this gentleman has ever been notified. So my options really are, fingers crossed, my Let Property campaign application will be accepted. If it isn't, I've put to the Nottingham team that I could make a similar submission to them. But unfortunately, they've refused to give me a caseworker who is prepared to put their name on a letter, which is quite astonishing, nor will they correspond by email, claiming that there's an issue with GDPR. So where would I go from here then? Well, I'm not usually one to complain to HMRC, which I do regret sometimes, because the reason I don't do it is because often it's not going to help my immediate client, but it would help future clients if I were to make more complaints. However, in this case, I have been advised that complaining does sometimes get you better treatment, and you'll get a decent person dealing with your issue. So that's one option. And the other option, which I may very well explore and pursue, is to request that HMRC deal with this under their Code of Practice 8, which is usually reserved for out of the ordinary tax issues. But given how appallingly this team are handling this gentleman's position, and the fact he's severely disabled and has mental health issues, I think that could be a good approach here. So may well be Code of Practice 8, which is the set of rules that HMRC will accord with where there's no element of deliberate behaviour. So the moral of the story really is, you know, HMRC have resumed activity, but my experience of them is they've got a lot of experienced people in the wrong places. In this case, I question whether the people I'm speaking to actually know what a tax inquiry is. So don't be afraid to challenge what you're being told, whether it be in writing or verbally, in particular verbally, and do draw upon your friendly tax dispute expert connections, who may have connections that can help you to progress your cases. So that's all I'd like to say on that one. Any questions through, Kevin?
No, keep going.
So moving on to handling HMRC inquiries, where you do actually receive a letter that suggests says or that notifies your client that they're under inquiry by HMRC. So these are my top tips. Setting aside the tax technical point, this is all about how to manage HMRC, stay on the front foot with the investigation and keep things moving and keep progress happening. So should you receive an inquiry letter, as I'm sure most of you, has happened to most of you before, my first piece of advice would be don't panic and continue to act for your client because you know them best. Certainly doesn't mean that you're likely to receive inquiries into other clients because you're the agent in common. It shows that you're putting your client's interests first. If you decide that you need to bring in specialist advice, you're just enhancing the service that your client is needing to draw upon. So once you've got the letter, you've decided you're the best person to take it forwards, I would check that HMRC has opened the inquiry in time. HMRC typically have a year from receiving the tax return to ask questions. And also check who is under inquiry. You need to be clear whether it's, for example, a company or an individual. And if it's the company, go through what HMRC are asking and just check that they're not bending their powers and venturing into information that is actually personal to the directors, when what they ought to be doing is asking for information that's relevant to checking the company's tax position. And then once you're clear on those points, I think it's important to discuss the inquiry letter at length, by which I mean with your client at first. And it might be easy to overlook this because, of course, you already feel and do know your client better than anybody. But I think discussions, it merits its own meeting to discuss what HMRC are asking. They might not be asking very much at all. So in that case, what could HMRC have in terms of information? What are they getting at? And that might be something that you can offer insights into, or you could have a call with somebody like me and they might be able to shed some light. And then as you go through any questions or requests for information that HMRC have put to you, it might be that certain information that's being requested that will benefit your client is not available. It might not exist. I've had a case recently where it would have been helpful if a contract had existed between two parties to split the sale proceeds, and therefore our client would only have been taxable on half of a capital gain, not the 100% HMRC was seeking. But just because a contract didn't exist, it doesn't mean that there was no evidence of such an agreement. So don't be afraid to challenge how specific HMRC's requests are and say, well, we can't give you this, but we can give you this, and evidence is the same point. And in all of this, particularly in the discussion with your client about the letter, I would try to get clear in my mind what position, what stance I will be taking later on when it comes to discussing penalties and the behaviour that's led to the error or omission, if in fact there has been one. Because what you would want to do, in my opinion, is I'd suggest you're framing all of your communications with HMRC ready for when you make these penalty representations for your client, which I would always try to do first rather than wait for HMRC to offer their proposed penalties to you at the end. One of the biggest bugbears I find that people have in dealing with HMRC and inquiries is delay. I think my personal favourite is probably change of inspector is on par with delay, but perhaps that's because I've sort of found tried and tested ways to combat delay. And one I would suggest to you is when you submit something to HMRC, I'd follow it up straight away. I'd firstly try to get email protocols in place, which, as you know, is one of the reasons I'm reluctant to deal with that Nottingham team, because it would just really impact on speed and progress if we can't correspond by email. So I'd get email protocols in place. And then when you submit your latest inquiry response by email, I'd follow up straight away or in the body of the email and say, hopefully now you've received my latest submission, would you mind letting me know by what date you're hoping to deal with it? Because the alternative of, say, giving them a month, then following up, it risks them saying, oh, I've not looked at it yet, I've not considered it yet. So don't be afraid to politely ask those questions as soon as you've put the ball back in their court, I suppose. And another thing is, if ever I can't deal with all points that are outstanding, I would consider whether I could make a part submission and say that the remainder is to follow. If, for example, I'm waiting for something from the client that's holding something up. I had a gentleman, an accountant, call me recently about a corporation tax inquiry letter he had on one of his clients. And it was, I think, about 4 pages long. And within those 4 pages, there was about a third of a page on employment status, the status of his client's workforce. And I said, that is going to be a huge part of this. So I think it was the case he was unable to respond on that part. So I said to keep it separate. But in addition, I went a bit further and I said, even when you're responding and you can deal with the status points in future communications, for example, what I'd suggest is you do produce your response on the status points as a standalone document and say it's an enclosure, because your best chance of getting somewhere with this inquiry, I said, is to close off all of the more straightforward accountancy and tax treatment based questions, and you'll probably just be left with this big status issue. And then what you might find is your original officer or caseholder will be moved on, whilst you're left to negotiate and work with a status officer at HMRC. So it would be good if all of that stuff on the status can sort of have its own folder, if you like, and be put separate. So that would be my advice with regard to collating information for HMRC, which you know, can be all-consuming at times if there's no clear plan. And finally, this comes up far more than it should do, even with colleagues of mine over the years. You get asked to review something or offer an opinion, and so many times I ask what the tax is. And for me, you need to always be reminding yourself, your client and HMRC of what it is everybody is fighting for here. What's the tax at stake? How much? If you remind HMRC of it, you putting into their minds whether it's worth them continuing, whether they should achieve settlement for what you're offering. If you mention it to your clients, first of all, it helps frame discussions about fees if the size of the problem is clear. But again, it helps them to understand how far they're prepared to go, and there might be potential to negotiate. It is still possible, providing you put forward reasonable methodology and proposals to HMRC, supported by sort of make it easy for them to concede on one point and agree on another if your client would be agreeable to that. So they're my sort of top things that would come to mind when dealing with HMRC inquiries. Of course, if you feel progress isn't made, then it's the right time to reach out and as I said before, revisit plans and strategy.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a few questions then. One from Leslie. Delays, what exactly can we do in practice stroke reality? Because there seems to be no comeback for us. And I think by that they mean the revenue they give us obviously our 30 days, if not less. And then they say, we'll get back to you. And I have seen one letter that said, I aim to get back to you within 6 months.
Yes. I think that my approach would be to try to be always polite, of course, but more forceful on all inquiries, like have a sort of standard way, which would include my follow-up, always trying to maintain a dialogue. And I mean, I have to say, it is a case of those that shout the loudest do end up getting dealt with, probably, unfortunately, because you just make people fed up, which I don't mind at all if they're thinking, I really need to get rid of this lady that keeps emailing me, all the better. I have had a case of my own, for example, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but the counter avoidance team are really slow, and there's a generic emailer box that you don't get any response from. Earlier in the year on my case, which I submitted full settlement figures on a disguised remuneration type project back in November, and I was in March, I think, threatening to apply to the tribunal for a closure notice. I thought that could work, so that's a tool in your armoury, depending on which team you're dealing with. But that was met with no response whatsoever. So then I started to, again, draw upon my connections and say, has anyone else had issues with this team, and can anyone suggest any contacts within HMRC? And I did manage to achieve success with a fairly junior gentleman at HMRC, but somebody passed me his name and they said he was good, and true to him, he did get the ball rolling for me, and I've now got settlement figures through from HMRC, which, that sounds a long time, but this client hadn't approached me at this time last year, and now they're in a position to close down the inquiry. So that would absolutely still be sat in the counter avoidance emailer box if I hadn't really racked my brains thinking outside the box and bringing it up every time I spoke to one of my fellow tax disputes people, saying, have you come across this? How can we sort it? There's things that you shouldn't be afraid to do, like asking who somebody's manager is and whether you could escalate something, a bit like I've done with this team in Nottingham, in saying, I need somebody else to speak to me, please, about whether you've notified my client of the inquiry. So I think it depends. Try everything, and don't give up. It would be my advice in a sentence. And of course, ask me if you need any more ideas.
Because at the end of the day, you can always ask for a closure notice, can't you, I guess?
Yes.
Yes. So Alex says, you mentioned various HMRC offices. He's recently received a letter from counter avoidance, and yet there seems to be no suggestion of counter avoidance in the case. Why is that? So
there's a letter received from counter avoidance.
Yeah.
And is the suggestion there's no mention within the letter of tax avoidance?
No, none. Yes, that's right. There's none at all. It's just asking details of an entry on a tax return, same as what we term a normal inquiry, as it were.
Yeah,
so Alex's query is, I guess, why is that issued by counter avoidance?
Yes, I suspect it's a case of HMRC not really having got a handle post-pandemic on where people need to be and what teams are working on what, and unfortunately counter avoidance do seem to be cropping up quite a lot. Perhaps their remit has been extended because of resourcing issues elsewhere, but it certainly sounds like Alex needs to know what they're looking into, doesn't it? But again, I think that question should be put to them.
Okay, thank you. As Leslie mentions, she's heard HMRC will never visit anymore. Is that true?
I would say that's a risky thing to believe. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, I did another webinar all about HMRC raids, which of course are historically known to be HMRC showing up unannounced at business premises or residential addresses. And I had a specialist lawyer doing that with me, and we absolutely said, you know, expect this to come back, the HMRC presence. There might be some changes to the way they conduct the raid when they are there. More obviously, there's more electronic data to be gathering, but certainly HMRC should and will still come out for visits.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so do a time check. Okay, so moving on to red flags and when to seek specialist support. This is something I considered for my own colleagues, actually, because as I suggested earlier, my involvement in the business, it's been a year now, and I need to educate colleagues on when their clients would benefit from me getting involved. So as a sort of checklist, if you like, which I'd strongly suggest you might create as a checklist. Number one, if no progress is being made with HMRC, that might be a good time to informally just have a chat with somebody like me and see if there anything's seen with some fresh eyes in how to progress things. Now, one thing I'd say is progress doesn't necessarily mean that letters are being exchanged every 2 months. I think it's necessary to look and think 6 months ago, a year ago. Unfortunately, it might have to be 2 years ago, depending on how slow HMRC are being. You'll ask yourself, where were we then? Where are we now? How many inquiry points have been closed off? And how have we reduced the tax being sought, for example? If that's not happening and letters are just going backwards and forwards, it might mean progress has halted. Of course, any evidence or suggestion of careless or deliberate behaviour, either from HMRC, they're suggesting it, or your client is owning up to it, you might want to have a discussion with a specialist. Anything involving Code of Practice 8 or Code of Practice 9, because it's the Fraud Investigation Service that deals with investigations conducted under either of those codes of practices. And it's probably worth saying that whilst Code of Practice 9 is widely considered, and it is a civil approach, the tax fraud that it's used to investigate is actually a criminal offence. It's just that the means through which HMRC investigate most of the tax fraud is a civil basis, so it's certainly very serious. Number 4, if the inquiry or investigation or disclosure involves offshore matters, that's purely because the penalties are so much greater, and you wouldn't want to say make a disclosure to the Digital Disclosure Service, for example, and because there's a small aspect of offshore, it gets referred on to the offshore team for further checks. Say offshore dividends were received by the individual and it wasn't an asset so offshore as such, but it gets flagged up. Goes without saying, anything involving criminal investigations, a suggestion of, a fear of criminal investigation, it's worth having a chat with a tax dispute resolution specialist who will have connections to suitable lawyers. So the lawyers will have connections to people like me and vice versa. So some support, it would be worth having a discussion in those instances. If the tax at stake is large, large will mean it will be devastating for the taxpayer if HMRC are successful in securing the settlement that they're looking for. That will mean a different quantum to different businesses and different people. And finally, this is one that a gentleman who I believe is on the call kindly offered me when I posted this list on LinkedIn recently, and he suggested that you might want to get specialist support if the relationship between you and your client is becoming strained. And I've had this before. Sometimes my clients, they're like, what side are you on? Are you on HMRC's side? And they're getting really frustrated. And as is suggested here, they may feel you're agreeing with HMRC too often, and you might just need somebody to stand your corner, or just to pass on to your client, you know, I've taken on board your concerns. I've spoken to someone that does this day in, day out. They've suggested they wouldn't have done anything different, and they've added that we might now want to try this or whatever. So I propose having this as sort of a go-to checklist on your inquiry, investigation portfolio, and just please do reach out to me or anybody else that offers the same service should you think it's worth a discussion.
Okay, thanks. A question just come in. You mentioned earlier the interest review unit. Have you any tips on how to be successful with that unit in getting interest mitigation?
Yes, I think first thing is you need to have paid the tax. So you have to do that first. Then it's very clear on HMRC's website how to make the application and where to send it. I've recently done one in a letter format. I would suggest that you, whilst it is a very emotive subject, I mean the case I have just dealt with involved a gentleman that had passed away, handling things for his elderly wife. I think you have to leave all feelings out of it and focus on the number crunching. So what HMRC want to see is a chronology. You know, who was waiting for who to respond during what period, and then you would apportion the interest according to your chronology. And there will be periods of delay which you might say, okay, we accept that that was normal. You might think to yourself, well, pre-pandemic I would have said more than 3 months was unreasonable delay by HMRC. Now you might have to accept that that has to be extended to 6 months. So anything beyond 6 months, you're going to seek the interest to be written off. But you know, if they got back within 6 months, you might have to be a bit more flexible on what you're prepared to accept as reasonable or not. So you're going to have a chronology. You're going to have the interest apportioned throughout, and then you're going to say, of that interest, what part do you think should be written off? And then that appeal goes in, and you await a response.
Okay, thank you. Sean has asked, when was the last time you saw a COP9 that wasn't voluntary?
Years and years, and that is a feeling that is shared with the other members on my contentious tax group I referred to. We've had discussions about this, and if I meet other people, like one-on-one, that question always comes up, because in our business you always wonder if everybody else is seeing Code of Practice 9s, because it's one of the largest types of case we would come across. And no, the feeling is the same, which is good news, I suppose, for the attendees here and their client base. HMRC have not been issuing many at all, as far as it's translating to the work that we're seeing come through.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I can see there. Thank you. Okay,
well, I'll only take an extra minute or so just to summarise. So, in summary, HMRC activity is increasing. We should soon reach pre-pandemic levels, possibly start of next year. The expertise at HMRC is lacking in their customer service, so do challenge and handle the requests that come from HMRC with care. Just trust your instincts, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And draw upon those with HMRC connections to progress your cases. If you're into LinkedIn, do post something on there. I'm very big on LinkedIn, and people will support you if they have any experience of what you're dealing with, and enhance relationships with your clients by bringing in specialist support at the right time. So that is all from me. happy to take any more questions. And thank you everyone for listening.
Okay, thank you. Can you move on to the next?
Yes.
Another slide there. Yep. So yeah, well, thank you for that, Sarah. On behalf of all our listeners, very comprehensive run through. I'm sure people found it very useful. So if anybody has any follow-up questions they want to ask, please email them in, and we can pass them on. Lastly, I would mention, of course, this is one of our monthly webinars. We hopefully have another one next month, although that will clash with our conference. So I'll do the unashamed plug for that now. We've got our 12th UK Tax Investigations Conference coming up. If anybody's interested, please do join up. You can either join virtually or in person this year. We've got some great speakers, and I'm sure it'll be a very, very useful day, including somebody from HMRC, whose use we'll have to wait and see. So once again, if you want to do that, please do sign up. So Sarah, over to you lastly to say your goodbyes, and thank you all for listening. Over to you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you everybody. Thanks very much, Kevin, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. And I'll certainly be keeping an eye on upcoming events in your network now that we've got acquainted. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much indeed. Bye-bye all. Speak to you soon.
Bye.